The boutique doors opened with a quiet chime, the kind meant to welcome shoppers with wealth and leisure. Andreas Cole stepped inside, her stride steady, her posture unhurried. The displays gleamed beneath the bright lighting. Rows of handbags arranged like museum pieces, shoes perched on glass stands, staff standing poised with rehearsed smiles. Yet the moment Andreas walked through, those smiles tightened, then faltered. It wasn't her attire. Her jacket was tailored, her heels polished, her watch worth more than most cars outside on the street. It wasn't her demeanor. She carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence only years of grit and triumph could teach. No, it was something else. Eyes followed her, not with admiration, but with quiet suspicion. From the far corner, one associate whispered to another. A second later, a guard appeared at the edge of the aisle, his steps direct, his stare unblinking. He wasn't there to offer help with a purchase. He was there because someone had already decided she didn't belong. Andreas paused in front of a display, lifting a bag from its perch. The leather was soft against her palm, the tag dangling like a small flag announcing its price. She held it for only a second before the voice came. "Ma'am, I'll need you to put that down." The tone was clipped, stripped of courtesy, heads turned. Another customer shifted uncomfortably, clutching her pearls as if luxury had to be guarded. Andreas raised her brows but said nothing, placing the bag back as requested. The guard didn't leave. "Do you have business here?" he asked. Her reply was steady. "I came to shop." It wasn't enough. The manager appeared, heels clicking, lips pursed into a line that carried judgment instead of service. "I think you may be in the wrong store," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. Andreas reached into her bag, sliding out a platinum card. "This should answer your doubts," but it didn't. The manager's arms crossed. "We'll have to ask you to leave." The humiliation was swift and sharp. Shoppers who had barely noticed her minutes earlier were now staring openly, some whispering. The guard moved closer, the space around her shrinking. Every second stretched, pressing against her dignity like a weight. Andreas didn't argue. She didn't shout. She placed her card back into her bag and straightened her shoulders. If they thought her silence meant weakness, they were wrong. She turned, walked toward the door, and stepped back into the street, unmoved on the surface, though the sting of the insult ran deep. Inside, the boutique settled quickly back into its rhythm, as though her presence had been nothing but a brief disturbance. Yet outside, Andreas's silence was not surrender. It was the start of something the staff inside could never have anticipated. Because in less than a day, the same people who forced her out would wake to find their future no longer in their hands. Before I continue with the story, I'd love for you to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. And let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I want to see the flags of every place where dignity still matters. Long before her name appeared in headlines, Andreas Cole was the girl who walked to school with shoes that barely held together. Her neighborhood was the kind most people drove past with their windows rolled up. Inside those small, weather-beaten houses, dreams often stopped at survival. But Andreas never stopped at survival. She remembered nights at the kitchen table, a single bulb flickering overhead while her mother balanced bills with the patience of someone holding a cracked glass together with bare hands. Andreas studied beside her, tracing equations in the margins of old newspapers, because notebooks cost too much. She promised herself then, if success was built brick by brick, she would lay every stone with her own hands. By high school, teachers noticed. Numbers weren't just subjects to her. They were languages she spoke fluently. She earned scholarships that carried her beyond the boundaries of her neighborhood. In lecture halls filled with doubt, she became the student professors couldn't ignore. Later, in boardrooms filled with men twice her age and nothing like her, she became the woman no one could dismiss. Andreas built her company in the volatile world of technology. What began as a small startup in a borrowed office grew into an empire. She invested in overlooked talent, hired from communities others ignored, and developed products that redefined convenience and security for millions of people. In time, her company's valuation soared past the billion-dollar mark. Yet what truly set her apart wasn't just her wealth, but her calm authority. She was known for never raising her voice, for meeting arrogance with composure, prejudice with dignity. She didn't dominate conversations by speaking louder, but by speaking less. And when she did, Her words lingered like iron doors closing. Success gave her access to the kinds of spaces that once felt out of reach. Penthouse suites, exclusive conferences, first-class cabins. But for Andreas, access never erased memory. She knew how quickly those spaces turned hostile when the people in them decided skin color mattered more than credentials. And so she carried herself with both grace and vigilance. Each entrance was measured, each glance acknowledged. Her presence was never accidental. It was deliberate. Yet no amount of grace, wealth, or reputation could shield her from the small, sharp edges of racism that waited in places where she least expected. That afternoon in the luxury store was proof. A woman who had reshaped industries, who had hired thousands and donated millions, who had been invited to advise governments on technology policy, was still seen by a clerk as someone out of place. Andreas wasn't just any customer. She was a billionaire CEO, a pioneer, a self-made leader. But in that moment, none of it mattered. To the staff who turned their backs on her, she wasn't an innovator or an employer of thousands. She was a black woman holding a handbag they decided she couldn't possibly afford. What they didn't know was this: Andreas Cole had never accepted being told where she did or didn't belong. They thought they were dealing with just another face to be ushered out. In truth, they were standing in front of the future owner of their entire chain. The boutique was designed to impress. Marble floors reflected the light, each display carefully angled so every handbag and shoe seemed to glow. Yet for Andreas Cole, it wasn't the products that drew attention. It was the stares. From the moment she stepped inside, whispers moved quicker than greetings. Two staff members by the register leaned close, their eyes darting toward her, then away again. One of them laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to shrink someone without a word. Andreas moved through the aisles with the poise she carried into every boardroom. She paused at a glass shelf, running her fingers across the edge of a purse priced in 5 figures. To her, it was no more than an object. To the employees watching, it was suddenly fragile in her hands. The manager appeared not long after. A woman with a sharp blazer and sharper tone, she crossed her arms before speaking. "Can I help you?" The words sounded less like an offer, more like a challenge. Andreas gave a polite nod. "Just browsing." The manager's eyes narrowed. "Browsing," she repeated, drawing the word out as though it didn't belong to customers who looked like Andreas. Silence stretched for a moment. Then came the second blow. "If you don't intend to make a purchase, we'll have to ask you not to loiter." The accusation landed heavy in the air. Customers nearby shifted uneasily, pretending to study displays while watching everything unfold. The word loiter wasn't just a warning, it was an insult. It carried the weight of assumptions built on skin, not on reality. Andreas straightened her shoulders. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She simply met the manager's eyes, her calm more unsettling than any outburst could have been. But calm was not what they wanted. A security guard arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, his expression already hard. He walked straight toward her, planting himself at her side as though she were a threat to the glass shelves around them. "Ma'am, I'll need you to leave." His voice was flat, rehearsed, as if he had said the same line to others before. Andreas reached into her purse and retrieved a platinum card, holding it lightly between 2 fingers. "I think this covers any doubt about my intentions." For a second, the guard faltered, but the manager's hand flicked toward the door, dismissing the gesture entirely. "I said we'll need you to leave. Now." The room shifted. Shoppers began recording on their phones, some openly, some pretending to scroll while their cameras captured everything. A murmur rose. Disbelief, discomfort, curiosity. Andreas could have raised her voice. She could have shouted about her billions, about her company, about the audacity of being treated as less than, in a place where she could have bought every single item 10 times over. Instead, she slid the card back into her bag. Her silence was deliberate, sharp, more cutting than any defense. Every step she took toward the exit carried dignity, even as the guard hovered too close behind her. The stares didn't stop, the whispers didn't fade. They wanted her gone, and they wanted her gone publicly. At the door, she paused. For just a moment, the manager caught her gaze again. There was no anger in Andreas's eyes, only a quiet promise, an unspoken warning that this insult would not vanish into the air like gossip. She stepped out onto the street. The doors closed behind her, shutting the scene off as if nothing had happened. Inside, the staff returned to their routines. The handbags still gleamed, The displays remained untouched, and the store believed it had rid itself of a nuisance. But what they failed to understand was that their dismissal wasn't the end of a minor inconvenience. It was the start of their undoing. Racism sometimes hides in the politeness of exclusion, and sometimes it plants the very seed of its own destruction. The incident inside the boutique should have ended at the door. That's what the staff believed when Andreas stepped out, their posture easing as if they had done their duty. But outside, phones were still recording. Within minutes, the clips hit social media. A woman posted the first video with a short caption, "This is how they treated a black woman for shopping." The footage showed Andreas being escorted out, her posture steady, her silence louder than the manager's words. Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. By evening, the hashtag Andreas Cole surged to the top of trending lists. What shocked many wasn't just the treatment of a customer, it was the recognition of who that customer was. Tweets poured in. "They threw out a billionaire. Imagine how they treat the rest of us. I've shopped there too. Same thing happened to me, just without cameras." Suddenly, Andreas's humiliation wasn't an isolated event. It was evidence of a pattern. Stories began surfacing. Other black customers recalling similar dismissals, being followed by security, denied service, or asked for proof of funds before making purchases. Comments flooded timelines. "I walked in with a friend and they asked her to leave while I was offered champagne. I spent $4,000 there and still felt like a thief. They profile us, no matter what we wear, no matter who we are." Every post added fuel. What had started as one video became a chorus of lived experiences. The store chain's name, once associated with exclusivity and prestige, was now dragged through thousands of voices, exposing its double standards. By the next morning, mainstream media had picked it up. Morning shows ran segments, "Black CEO kicked out of luxury store." Analysts discussed it on business networks, shaking their heads at the irony of alienating a woman whose net worth dwarfed the entire boutique's yearly revenue. Reporters camped outside the store headquarters, firing questions the company refused to answer. The footage ran on loop. Andreas, calm, dignified, walking past a guard who treated her as an intruder. Anchors didn't need to add much. The video spoke for itself. Pressure mounted, and eventually, the brand released a statement. The words were polished, but hollow. "We regret any misunderstanding that occurred in one of our locations. We are committed to providing excellent service to all of our valued customers." No mention of racism, no accountability, just a misunderstanding. The response only made things worse. Commentators tore it apart online. "You don't misunderstand dignity. That wasn't a mistake. That was discrimination. Apologies mean nothing when dignity is stripped in public." Stock prices began to dip. Customers announced boycotts. Influencers posted videos cutting up store credit cards, declaring they would never shop there again. Meanwhile, Andreas remained silent. She didn't post a statement, didn't call a press conference. Her restraint frustrated journalists, but it amplified her power. People wondered what she was planning, why she hadn't spoken. Silence, once more, became her sharpest weapon. Inside boardrooms, panic grew. Executives calculated losses, weighed PR campaigns, debated hiring consultants to manage the scandal. Yet they couldn't control the narrative anymore. The story belonged to the public, and the public wasn't letting go. What the executives didn't know was that Andreas's silence wasn't absence. It was preparation. While they scrambled to contain the fallout, she was setting in motion the kind of move that would change their company forever. The staff who escorted her out believed they had ended her presence with a gesture toward the door. In reality, they had opened a door they would never be able to close again. In the whirlwind of hashtags, media headlines, and corporate panic, one voice remained, noticeably absent. Andreas Cole's. She didn't tweet a response. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't release a statement to clarify her side. The world filled in the silence with speculation, but those who truly knew her understood. Andreas never moved in haste. She moved with intent. Behind the tinted glass walls of her office tower, she reviewed the events not as a victim, but as a strategist. The store chain had done more than insult her dignity. It had revealed a weakness. A business that thrived on exclusivity had exposed its arrogance, and arrogance left cracks wide enough for opportunity. Her advisors crowded the boardroom table, some enraged, others anxious. "You should sue," one said. "Take him for millions, you'd win easily." Another leaned forward, his voice urgent. This could be a civil rights case. The footage is undeniable. Andreas listened but didn't react. Litigation might bring headlines, but it wouldn't bring change. Lawsuits end with settlements, apologies crafted by lawyers, and promises that fade once the cameras leave. That wasn't enough. She turned to her legal counsel. I want an acquisition report. How much would it cost to buy them outright? The room went silent. Her chief financial officer cleared his throat, unsure if he had heard correctly. Buy? The chain? Yes, Andreas said, her voice calm, steady. If they don't want me as a customer, then let's see how they function when I am the owner. Within hours, her team began pulling numbers. The boutique wasn't just one store. It was part of a luxury group with multiple locations across the country and franchises abroad. The valuation was high, but Andreas's resources were higher. Her company had weathered tech downturns, navigated global expansions, and held reserves ready for bold moves. This would not cripple her empire, it would expand it. She made phone calls quietly, reaching out to investors, allies, and bankers who owed her favors. Many were eager to join her. They saw profit, of course, but they also saw justice in motion, a statement too powerful to ignore. Meanwhile, the store's executives scrambled with their own crisis management. They believed their problem was reputational. They didn't realize their very ownership was slipping through their fingers. By dawn, Andreas' attorneys had filed the initial paperwork. Negotiations were swift, fueled by the store's crumbling public image. Shareholders panicked as boycotts mounted. Some were eager to sell, preferring to escape before the brand's value sank further. What Andreas was orchestrating wasn't revenge in the usual sense. It was reclamation of dignity, of control, of power. When word reached her that the majority stake was within reach, she didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, she sat back in her chair, the same way she had when she was a young girl watching her mother balance impossible bills. She had learned early that the best response to disrespect wasn't anger, it was stability. By the time the ink dried, less than 24 hours after she had been forced out of the store, Andreas Cole was no longer an outsider. She was the owner. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same manager who accused her of loitering now reported, indirectly but undeniably, to her. The same guard who shadowed her walk to the door now wore a uniform under a company whose leadership bore her name. This wasn't about handbags or displays. It was about rewriting the rules of who gets to belong. Andreas didn't rush to announce the acquisition. She allowed the press, the shareholders, and the public to connect the dots themselves. Within hours, news outlets broke the story. Billionaire CEO who was kicked out buys the entire chain. The headline moved faster than the original video. Television anchors read it with disbelief. Business journals analyzed it as a bold market move. Social media erupted with new energy. The hashtag changed from outrage to celebration. One comment captured the mood perfectly. She walked out their doors in silence and came back as their boss. The store had stripped her of dignity in public. Now the entire world was watching as she claimed it back, and then some. The boardroom was meant to intimidate. A long, polished table stretched toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the skyline glittered in the distance. For years, executives had gathered here in tailored suits, discussing strategies to attract elite customers and preserve the brand's image of exclusivity. But on this morning, the atmosphere was different. Whispers lingered in the corners, eyes darted nervously toward the door. Andreas Cole stepped inside, unhurried. Her presence was steady, her silence commanding. She didn't need an entourage. Her very arrival shifted the air. The same company that had humiliated her was now forced to face her as its new majority shareholder. Executives straightened in their seats. Some cleared their throats, others adjusted their ties, as if appearance alone could disguise the panic beneath. One of them, a gray-haired director with decades in the industry, was the first to speak. "Miss Cole, we didn't expect." Andreas raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I'm not here for pleasantries." The words landed with the weight of finality. She walked slowly toward the head of the table, the seat once reserved for the company's CEO. Without hesitation, she pulled it out and sat down. The gesture wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Authority had shifted, and everyone knew it. One executive tried to recover ground. "This acquisition, it's highly unusual. Perhaps you'd like to discuss terms privately." Her gaze cut through him. "The terms are already signed. What I want to discuss is accountability." A hush fell. The very word seemed foreign in that room. Andreas leaned forward. Your brand profits from projecting luxury. But tell me, what luxury exists when a black woman can't shop in your store without being treated like a criminal? No one answered. Eyes dropped to the polished table, pens clicked nervously. The silence was more damning than any admission. She continued, her tone calm but edged with steel. I was escorted out of one of your stores like I didn't belong. Your manager called me a loiterer. Your guard treated me as though my presence was a threat, and none of you in this room thought it necessary to address the deeper issue in your public apology. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. We regret what happened. Andreas interrupted, her voice steady. Regret is cheap, action is costly, and I intend to see action. She looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes in turn. You didn't want me as a customer. Now, I am your employer. Let that settle for a moment. The statement cracked through the air, leaving the executives visibly unsettled. For some, shame flickered. For others, defensiveness hardened. But none could deny the truth. The balance of power had reversed completely. Andreas reached into her bag and placed her platinum card on the table. The same card dismissed by the manager now gleamed under the boardroom lights. This was enough to buy your products. It wasn't enough to buy dignity in your stores, so I bought the entire company instead. Her words hung heavy. No one dared move. Finally, she leaned back. This isn't just business. This is a reckoning. Racism thrives in silence. In your stores, silence was policy. That ends today. The younger executive, voice trembling, asked, What happens now? Andreas didn't smile, but her tone softened slightly. What happens now is change. And if you can't stand for it, you won't stand in this room much longer. She rose from her seat, leaving the platinum card behind on the table, a symbol not of wealth, but of transformation. As she walked out, the executive sat frozen, realizing that the power they once guarded had slipped into the hands of the very woman they tried to exclude. Outside the boardroom, staff lined the hall, curious and anxious. Word had spread quickly. The woman humiliated in public was now the owner of everything around them. For the first time in years, whispers carried not entitlement, but awe. Andreas didn't need to announce victory. Her presence declared it for her. The reckoning had only begun. The boardroom confrontation made headlines, but Andreas Cole knew her story was more than a personal victory. It was a window into a problem millions faced every day, one that rarely reached news anchors or front pages. Her humiliation had gone viral because she was a billionaire. But what about the people without cameras, without influence, without wealth to shield them? Her silence in the hours after the incident had been strategic. Now, her words carried the weight of lived truth. In interviews, she didn't just describe what happened to her. She spoke about the thousands of others who had written to her since the video spread. Letters came from students, nurses, teachers, and retirees. Each message was a mirror of her own experience, being followed in stores, denied service, asked to prove legitimacy in spaces where they were supposed to belong. A mother from Chicago wrote, "My son saved for months to buy sneakers. The manager asked if the card was stolen." A lawyer from Atlanta shared, "I've won cases in the Supreme Court, yet I'm still shadowed by guards when I shop." A teenager from Los Angeles posted a video saying, "When I saw them do that to you, I realized I wasn't imagining it all these years. It's real." These voices filled the silence left by corporations that preferred to ignore uncomfortable truths. Andreas amplified them. In one televised interview, a host asked her, "Do you think this happened to you because you're black?" Andreas didn't pause. "It happened to me because this society trains certain people to see my skin before my success. It doesn't matter if I'm a billionaire or a student. The first thing they measure is the color of my face." Her answer resonated. Ratings spiked, clips were replayed, and hashtags multiplied. But more importantly, conversations began at dinner tables, classrooms, and offices. People questioned the quiet biases that often went unnoticed until they exploded into public humiliation. Andreas wasn't the first to speak about it, but her story had weight because it stripped away excuses. If a woman who could buy the entire store wasn't safe from profiling, who was? Analysts on business networks dissected it too. One said, "This is bigger than retail. It's about how institutions fail to adapt to diversity." Another added, "You can't market inclusivity while practicing exclusion." For once, financial television wasn't only about profits, it was about prejudice. Community leaders saw an opening. Civil rights groups cited Andreas's case as proof of what they had been fighting for decades. Universities added her story to lectures on race and economics. Even children in schools spoke about it, repeating the line that had spread like wildfire. They didn't want her as a customer. Now she's the owner. The bigger picture wasn't just about corporate image, it was about trust. How many people stopped shopping at those boutiques, not because they couldn't afford them, but because they refused to pay for humiliation? Andreas highlighted that reality during a press appearance. Money doesn't erase racism. Education doesn't erase racism. Success doesn't erase racism. Only truth and change can. Her words weren't poetic, they were plain, unflinching, and that made them impossible to dismiss. Statistics began to surface alongside her story. Studies showing that Black shoppers were more likely to be followed by staff. Research revealing how resumes with ethnic names were overlooked. Data proving what many had lived but few had measured. Bias wasn't rare, it was routine. Andreas's humiliation had lit a fire under those numbers. Suddenly, they weren't just lines in a report. They were connected to a face, a name, a story impossible to forget. What struck the public most wasn't just her wealth or power, it was how easily those things evaporated in the eyes of people who chose not to see her humanity. If Andreas Cole could be treated as invisible, then the system was broken far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Her voice carried this truth. What happened to me is not unusual. What's unusual is that the world noticed. But for every story that trends, there are thousands that vanish. How do we fix that silence? The question lingered, sharp and unavoidable. Andreas didn't want pity. She wanted accountability. And by forcing the public to see the bigger picture, she had shifted the conversation from one humiliating afternoon to a national reckoning. When the acquisition became public, headlines screamed of irony and revenge. But Andreas Cole didn't frame it that way. To her, ownership wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of change. She had no interest in ruling over a broken culture. She wanted to rebuild it. Her first act as majority owner was not to replace logos or raise prices. It was to meet with the people who worked the floors, the ones who had spent years under policies that encouraged exclusion without ever naming it. She visited store locations unannounced, not with cameras, but with intent. In one flagship boutique, employees froze when they saw her walk in. Some looked embarrassed, others afraid. Andreas didn't scold them. Instead, she gathered them together and asked a single question. How do you want customers to feel when they walk through these doors? The room stayed quiet at first. Then, slowly, voices emerged. A young clerk admitted she had always been told to keep an eye on certain customers. Another confessed she'd been reprimanded for offering service too quickly to people who didn't look like buyers. Their honesty was raw, uncomfortable, but necessary. Andreas listened, not to condemn individuals, but to expose the system that had shaped them. She responded with clarity. This company will not survive on exclusion. From now on, dignity is policy. Within weeks, reforms began. Diversity training wasn't just a slideshow, it was immersive, mandatory, and continuous. Hiring practices shifted to recruit from underrepresented communities. Store managers who resisted were replaced with leaders who understood inclusion was not a trend, but a necessity. Andreas also looked inward at the company's structure. For too long, decision-making power had been concentrated in people who resembled one another and carried the same biases. She broke that pattern by promoting talent long overlooked. A Black sales associate in Atlanta became a regional manager. A Latina clerk in Houston, who had been stuck in entry-level roles for years, was elevated to oversee training across multiple states. Customers noticed the changes too. For the first time, shoppers of all backgrounds were greeted without suspicion. New advertising campaigns reflected a broader spectrum of faces and voices. Sales, once in decline, began to rise, not because luxury was redefined, but because belonging had finally been built into its foundation. Andreas's reforms extended beyond the stores. She established a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs of color, financed by a percentage of the company's profits. She also launched an initiative to partner with minority-owned suppliers, ensuring that the wealth flowing through her business reached further than it ever had before. Media outlets followed closely, eager to label her every move as corporate revenge. Andreas corrected them in a press conference. This is not about revenge. This is about rewriting what it means to serve the public. Luxury without dignity is worthless. Business without justice is hollow. If a store cannot see the humanity of its customers, then it has no right to their loyalty. Her words struck deeper than any advertisement could. Letters poured in, not just from shoppers, but from workers across industries. One retail employee wrote, "For the first time, I believe my job could be about service, not suspicion." Another message read, "You showed us that change isn't only possible, it's necessary." The ripple effect was undeniable. Competing brands, worried about being caught in similar scandals, began reviewing their own policies. Some followed Andreas' example, introducing reforms they had long delayed. Others struggled to adjust, but the pressure from public expectation had already shifted. For Andreas, this was the true victory. Not that she had bought the company that humiliated her, but that she had turned it into a platform for equity. What had begun as an insult now served as a blueprint for justice. In one televised interview, she reflected, "The store tried to write me out of its story, but I chose to rewrite the story for everyone who walks through its doors. They thought exclusion was strength. I've proven inclusion is stronger." It was more than a soundbite. It was the living truth of her actions. The humiliation of being escorted out had been transformed into a movement that touched not just the company, but the people who depended on it. For the customers who once feared being judged, there was relief. For the employees who had long swallowed orders that went against their values, there was hope. And for every person watching who had been told they didn't belong, there was proof that dignity could not just be reclaimed, it could be institutionalized. Andreas Kohl had shown the world that racism might strip dignity in a moment, but justice, when pursued with vision, could restore it for generations. The transformation of the luxury chain under Andreas Kohl did more than heal the insult of one afternoon. It struck a chord across the world. As her policies rolled out and the headlines continued, the public found themselves not just watching, but participating. On social media, hashtags morphed from outrage into celebration. Where Andreas Kohl had once been a banner of humiliation, it now carried pride. Posts streamed in from every corner of the globe. A college student in Detroit tweeted, "She turned an insult into ownership. That's the kind of energy we need." A nurse in London wrote, "We've all felt that stare, that silent judgment. She answered it for all of us." A man in Johannesburg posted, "For once, the story didn't end with an apology. It ended with power shifting hands." Instagram filled with photos of shoppers proudly holding their purchases from Andreas' stores, captions declaring, "I'm here because I belong." Others posted videos outside boutiques, speaking directly to the camera, "They can't turn us away anymore." But the reactions weren't limited to customers. Employees within the company began sharing their own experiences under the new leadership. One former associate who had worked 5 years without promotion wrote an open letter. "When I saw Andreas step into our store, I thought I'd lose my job. Instead, she gave me one I'd been denied for years." Another message from a clerk in New York went viral. "I used to be told to watch certain people. Now I'm told to welcome everyone. That one change lifted a weight I didn't even realize I carried." The honesty of these testimonies gave Andreas' reforms credibility beyond press releases. They showed that transformation wasn't just about statements, it was lived in real time by real people. News outlets sensing the cultural shift returned to the story. Analysts framed it not just as a business triumph, but as a civil rights moment. One anchor said, "What Rosa Parks was to buses, Andreas Kohl may be to retail spaces." She exposed the silent segregation of the shopping world and changed it with ownership. The comparison stirred debate, but the symbolism was undeniable. Dignity in everyday spaces mattered. Schools, too, took notice. Teachers used Andreas' story as case studies in classrooms, asking students to reflect on discrimination they had witnessed. Universities invited her to speak on leadership, where she reminded future business leaders, "Profit without justice is failure in disguise." The story even reached into homes where parents sat their children down to watch her interviews. One father posted, "I showed my daughter Andreas' speech because I want her to know she doesn't have to fight for a seat at someone else's table. She can buy the table." For many, Andreas became more than a CEO. She was a symbol of possibility, proof that the pain of racism could be turned into power. Yet not every reaction was celebratory. Some critics argued she had only acted because she had wealth. "Most people can't buy a company when they're disrespected," one columnist wrote. Andreas acknowledged this in a rare statement. I don't expect everyone to respond as I did, but I do expect every company to treat every person with respect, whether they can buy a business or buy a single item. That balance of humility and strength deepened public admiration. She didn't use her wealth to distance herself from others. She used it to amplify their shared experiences. Perhaps the most striking reactions came from people who had nothing to do with retail at all. A black pilot posted, "If she can flip an industry, I can hold my head higher in mine." A Latina engineer wrote, "When she walked out with silence and came back as owner, I realized I don't need to shrink anymore." The ripple effect stretched further than luxury fashion. It reached into offices, schools, hospitals, and households. People carried Andreas's story like armor, proof that dignity denied could become dignity reclaimed. In the comments of one news article, a woman summed it up. She wasn't just buying a company, she was buying back our right to exist without suspicion. And through it all, Andreas herself stayed measured. She didn't celebrate with extravagance or gloat over her critics. Instead, she continued speaking softly, the same way she had carried herself in that store. Her calm had once been mistaken for weakness. Now, the world understood it as power. For every person who had been trailed by security, asked for extra ID, or treated as invisible, her victory was theirs too. The audience had made their verdict clear. Andreas Cole was more than a headline. She was the proof that racism, when exposed and confronted, could be forced to bow before justice. The day after Andreas Cole's acquisition was finalized, the company's executives faced their reckoning. For years they had sat in comfort, shielded by prestige, convinced their exclusivity could never be challenged. But under Andreas's leadership, silence was no longer an option. The first confrontation came swiftly. At an emergency shareholders meeting, Andreas outlined her vision for reform. Some nodded in agreement, but others resisted. One board member, his voice taut with frustration, said, "Our clientele expects a certain image. If we make drastic changes, we risk losing the very people who built this brand." Andrea's response was direct. "If our image depends on discrimination, then it is an image worth losing. Luxury without respect is worthless." Her words carried weight, but not everyone accepted them. Within days, several long-serving executives resigned, citing irreconcilable differences. Their departures made headlines, but Andreas welcomed the shift. To her, it wasn't instability, it was cleansing. The leadership that had fostered exclusion had no place in the company's future. Meanwhile, rivals circled like vultures, eager to exploit the scandal. Competing luxury brands released statements positioning themselves as inclusive, some even hinting that Andreas's acquisition was reckless. A well-known CEO of a competitor remarked in an interview, "Buying a company out of anger is not strategy, it's ego." Andreas didn't flinch. When asked for her response, she simply said, "It wasn't anger that bought this company, it was dignity. And dignity will always be profitable." Her calm rebuttal silenced critics and fueled public admiration. Customers applauded her refusal to be baited into hostility. The message was clear. She wasn't playing for applause, she was playing for permanence. Inside the boutiques, the changes became visible. Posters once featuring narrow images of beauty now reflected diversity. Staff who had once been taught suspicion were retrained in service that honored all customers equally. Not every employee welcomed the shift, but Andreas made the terms clear. If equality feels uncomfortable, this is no longer the place for you. As reform spread, so did confrontation with the past. Andreas quietly ordered reviews of customer complaints filed over the last decade. The findings were damning. Hundreds of incidents of profiling and unfair treatment had been dismissed or ignored. She made them public, not to shame individuals, but to expose the culture that had enabled them. Critics accused her of dragging the company through the mud. Investors worried about backlash, but Andreas countered, "Truth doesn't ruin a company. Silence does." The consequences extended beyond the company walls. Legislators cited Andreas's acquisition as proof that stronger anti-discrimination policies were needed in retail. Civil rights advocates used her story as a rallying cry, demanding accountability from other luxury brands. The ripple effects made it clear, this was no longer about one store, it was about an industry. For Andreas, the weight of leadership came with personal challenges too. Invitations to exclusive gatherings arrived, but not all were genuine. Some hosts extended courtesy to shield themselves from criticism, while others withheld invitations altogether, unwilling to accept her rise. Andreas remained unfazed. She had no desire to sit at tables where her presence was merely tolerated. Instead, she built her own. She hosted summits on equitable business practices, bringing together leaders from industries often blind to their biases. She created spaces where the rules were rewritten, where inclusion was not charity, but standard. Stock analysts watched closely. At first, shares wavered as uncertainty loomed, but as customer loyalty surged under the reforms, profits began to climb. Ironically, the very changes critics had warned against became the foundation of renewed success. Journalists framed it as poetic justice. A company once brought low by arrogance, now rising through the very principle it had ignored: respect. Yet Andreas herself refused to frame it as a simple victory. In a keynote speech, she reminded the public, "Don't mistake progress for completion. This company is better today, but racism does not vanish with one acquisition. It lingers wherever silence is allowed. My job is to ensure silence has no home here." Her words underscored the stakes. Confrontations were not just external, they were daily, embedded in policies, decisions, and attitudes. But each consequence carried transformation. Executives gone, policies reformed, profits recovered. And a company once defined by exclusion now learning, under new leadership, that dignity is the most valuable currency of all. The consequences of one act of racism had grown larger than anyone inside that boutique could have imagined. And Andreas Cole, who walked out of its doors in silence, now stood as proof that silence, when held with purpose, could change everything. The story of Andreas Cole began with humiliation at a boutique door and ended with her sitting at the helm of the very empire that tried to deny her. But the weight of her victory was never about wealth or ownership. It was about dignity reclaimed and justice enforced. When she looked back at that single afternoon, she saw more than her own pain. She saw the reflection of countless others who had been dismissed, doubted, or degraded in public spaces. Her acquisition had given her the power to reform one company, but her voice had given courage to thousands. In a final press conference, she stood before a crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones extended. Her presence was calm, her words deliberate. "Let me be clear," Andreas began, her voice unwavering. "What happened to me was not unique. It happens to people every single day. The only difference is that my wealth made the world pay attention. But respect should not depend on wealth. It should not depend on influence. It should not depend on anything but our shared humanity." Her words cut through the noise, forcing even her critics to listen. "I did not buy this company to prove I could. I bought it because silence has no power until you give it purpose." The insult I endured could have faded into yet another apology, another empty statement. Instead, it became the foundation for reform. That is what every act of justice requires: the courage to turn humiliation into action. The audience listened, not just to a billionaire CEO, but to a woman who had faced the sting of prejudice and transformed it into a blueprint for equity. She continued, "Racism thrives when it hides in plain sight, when managers call it a misunderstanding, when guards call it procedure, when companies call it policy. What happened to me was not a misunderstanding. It was exclusion, and exclusion is not a policy we will ever accept again." The crowd erupted in applause. Andreas lifted a hand, quieting the room. "To every person who has been followed through aisles, doubted at counters, or humiliated at doors, you belong. And to those who profit from treating customers with suspicion, you will answer for it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but accountability comes whether you are ready or not." It wasn't just a statement, it was a warning. After the press conference, letters poured in again. Parents wrote that they showed the speech to their children. Workers said they demanded change in their own companies. Customers promised to support businesses that aligned with dignity over discrimination. Andreas had never sought to become a symbol, but her story had become one nonetheless. Not because she was untouchable, but because she had been touched by the same prejudice millions endure and chose to answer it with power. As the cameras dimmed and the microphones lowered, she walked away, knowing the work was far from finished. But her journey had proven something vital. That silence, when wielded with strength, can become the loudest answer of all. They thought money was power. Andreas showed them dignity was priceless. They thought exclusion would shrink her. She expanded until she owned the very walls that pushed her out. They thought she was just another face to dismiss. She became the face of change. Now it's your turn. Have you ever been judged wrongly in public? Have you stood in a place where people looked at you and decided you didn't belong? Would you have spoken up, or would you have walked out in silence like Andreas did, knowing that silence could one day become the answer? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And make sure you include your country's flag so we can see just how many corners of the world are united in demanding dignity. Strong call to action. If Andreas' story moved you, if it reminded you that justice requires action, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can build a space where stories like these are not exceptions, but reminders that change is possible. Because dignity belongs to all of us. Everywhere. Always.